Silicon Bites episode 66. It is an illusion that Putin wants the war to end. In fact, he needs the war not to end in order to perpetuate his regime. There are no limits to how many Russians he will sacrifice to save his own neck, how much blood he will spill to save the 10.5 pints in his own body. He is quite prepared to burn all of Russia's economy and resources for as long as that helps to keep him in power. So the determination of President-elect Donald Trump to achieve a settlement of the war, any deal in fact, so he can tell his supporters that he delivered on campaign promises, seems to put him at odds with Putin's ambitions. As we've suggested in a recent episode, it would seem that Putin and Trump are on a collision course. Putin has several reasons to escalate in the coming weeks, and indeed no reasons to de-escalate, and he is already showing signs that this policy is well underway. Here are some of the reasons he may choose to escalate further. One, he escalates the situation so that no parties can agree to a settlement. This is risky as it enters the territory of extreme brinksmanship. Whereas Biden's policy has been to self-deter and cede to Putin escalation dominance, there are strong indicators from the choice of General Kellogg that this will not be Trump's approach. I've argued that he understands Putin's gangster mindset operating under Kremlin rules much better than Biden's team, and that to win against such a strategy, you need to show implacable strength against Russia, not weakness and concessions. And indeed, some of the interviews that General Kellogg has given over the last couple of months seem to suggest that he understands this psychology, understands this dynamic of how to negotiate with the Kremlin. Option number two, Putin escalates to grab more territory and have a stronger hand in future negotiations, which he may now see as unavoidable. No cost will be too high in material and human life, but Putin needs something that his propagandists can spin to their Z Patriot audience. Idea number three. If the information Putin is getting from commanders on the ground as well as military leadership is still inaccurate, sugar-coated, manipulated, then he may well be deluded enough to think that he can continue to prosecute the war through 2025 and achieve his maximalist objectives, that is, take all of Ukraine or at least Kiev and Odessa. If he thinks there is a chance for full victory, then why would he capitulate now, especially as he may view that a pause in hostilities for a few years may benefit Kiev as much as or even more than it does Russia. And finally, number four, if his information is more realistic and his understanding of his own political environment as accurate as it has traditionally been, in fact, then he may understand that to end the war will mark the beginning of the end for his regime and his life as well. He may see no way to a comprehensive or even partial victory in Ukraine, but has no option but to continue the fight. It's possible Russia's economic and political collapse would accelerate if the war stopped, especially as other dominoes of Russia's foreign policy are wobbling in Syria, Ukraine and sub-Saharan Africa. Any end to the war may be seen as a failure. But both physical aggression and the use of threat are likely to form part of Putin's pre-negotiation tactics. We predicted this on the channel, that the ambitions of Trump and Putin would rapidly diverge, but this is happening far faster than we even suspected they would. Both Putin and Patrushev have made thinly veiled threats directly towards Trump and his administration in the last week. And this is likely to be a form of hardball negotiation tactic. Zelensky, in an address to the nation on Thursday, emphasized how Putin is promoting his new missile, his readiness to kill and destroy. Putin clearly wants to add thousands more, he explained, to the pile of corpses. He has no interest in ending this war. Moreover, Putin wants to prevent others from ending this war. By wagging his Oreshnik now, he is aiming solely to disrupt the efforts of President Trump that are sure to follow his inauguration. Putin wants to escalate the situation now so that that President Trump fails to end the war. Zelensky, at least, seems convinced by this argument. At the very least, significant escalation of violence and threat of violence will be part of Putin's negotiation strategy ahead of any dialogue. That is why Putin's escalation now is a form of pressure aimed at eventually forcing the President of the United States to accept Russia's terms. We are aware of all the existing threats, Zelensky emphasized. Zelensky has implored Ukrainians to take shelter whenever air raid alerts go off and missile threats are announced. This is a firm rule, he said, a rule that does not depend on any statements coming from Russia. Right now, there may be even more attempts by Russia to spread fear and despair in Ukraine. We all need resilience to get through this, and we need unity with all our partners. Indeed, if Putin still thinks he can have a comprehensive victory in Ukraine, then these strikes designed to undermine the resilience of Ukrainian civilians will no doubt intensify. It's unlikely they will work in this aim, but that will not stop Putin from trying. Zelensky stated that Putin is now doing what he always does, intimidating, dividing, and trying to break or destabilize each one of us individually. He can do nothing else. He loses when he is isolated, and he must lose now in everything. It will be safer for everyone if he loses. Putin stated at the CSTO summit in Astana that decision-making centers in Kiev could become targets of the next strikes involving the Oreshnik experimental ballistic missiles. The strike on Dnipro was purely kinetic and no explosives were contained in the warheads, so the damage was apparently limited. The threat seems to be at great variance with the reality that we've seen. But if Putin were to weaponize the warheads or even go nuclear, then it's likely that the conventional response from the US and NATO would be overwhelming and an extinction-level event for Russian troops on the territory of Ukraine. This much, at least, has been made crystal clear to Putin by President Biden. We will use the means at our disposal. We do not exclude the use of Oreshnik against the Ukrainian military, against military-industrial facilities, or against decision-making centers, including in Kiev, bearing in mind that the Kiev authorities today continue to attempt to strike at our vital facilities, said Putin. But these words will not intimidate Zelensky and probably will not have any impact on the calculus of President-elect Trump or his appointed negotiator. And interestingly, both Putin and Patrushev have issued chilling and not so subtle threats against Trump following the appointment of General Kellogg and the green lighting of ATACMS on the territory of Russia. Putin described Trump as intelligent, but warns US President-elect he may not be safe. This is a bit like pointing to an open window in Moscow and saying, "Be careful." Putin said President-elect Trump had overcome a serious threat to return to the White House and suggested that absolutely uncivilized means of struggle were used against him, referring to the two alleged assassination attempts. He said Trump was an experienced politician capable of finding, quotes, solutions, but said at the same time he did not believe Trump was safe following his assassination attempts. Rather than out of an abundance of concern for his safety, these phrases must be taken as an implicit threat not to court even greater danger. It's an implied threat to not go too far beyond what Putin would see as an acceptable framework for negotiations to end the war, i.e., we can interpret this as Putin suggesting that Trump gives in to Russia's terms and does not negotiate in a way that is advantageous to Ukraine. Putin also slammed the humiliating and unfounded judicial procedures against Trump during the campaign. As a great supporter of the rule of law in his own country, Putin's comments are, of course, deeply ironic. In June, a jury found Trump guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records in his hush money trial, making him the first US president to be convicted of a felony. But this is just theatre of the absurd, the important comments followed this. He lashed out at the outgoing US President Joe Biden for creating additional difficulties, quotes, for the incoming Trump administration, referring to Biden's move to allow Ukraine to fire longer-range American missiles called ATACMS at targets in Russia. However, this is where the Kremlin propagandists and even Putin may be getting nervous. With the appointment of Kellogg and some clear signs that the Trump and Biden national security teams are actually communicating extensively, and a recent meeting between Biden and Trump has unnerved the Kremlin. It's certain that Biden communicated to Trump the steps he was about to take, including permission for ATACMS and the fast-tracking of arms supplies to Ukraine. It's also possible that Trump tacitly approves of this happening now, as it means he won't have to be seen to make such a decision when he comes to office. The rabid outburst of Tucker Carlson, Trump Jr., and many others may just be a smokescreen for something that actually Trump sees as being rather advantageous to his forthcoming negotiation. Rather than creating difficulties for Trump, Biden may be helping to soften Russia up, enhancing the chances of Trump's negotiation strategy succeeding. This and the decision to sanction Gazprom Bank are causing Putin's military and economic positions to weaken dramatically. This is not a good place to be ahead of potential discussions. The threat of global conflict is serious and real, said Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Despite NATO assessing that Russia's use of the Oreshnik weapon will not change the course of the conflict, it does seem that the war is reaching a critical phase, and indeed, as Putin's position deteriorates, his propensity to escalate in a reckless way is increasing, just as his power is weakening in inverse proportion. Of course, Kremlin puppets have also been activated to squawk out the same messages of intimidation. Hungarian PM Viktor Orban said the West should take Putin's warning, including the claim that Russia has a stock of missiles ready to be used, at face value. Experts, though, assess that Putin's stock of these missiles may be very limited, and claims by Putin that Russia has begun mass production of the Oreshnik system are likely a bluff. But of course, Orban will amplify any nonsense on command from the Kremlin and surrender immediately to its terroristic aggression. Putin's absurd hyperbole reached even greater heights, which, it has to be said, even some Z patriots are not finding convincing. He said the temperature of these striking elements reaches 4,000 degrees. Everything at the epicenter of the Oreshnik blast disintegrates into fractions and elementary particles. Essentially, it turns to dust. Well, Putin trots out this ghoulish nonsense with great glee, apparently. Any world leaders still treating him as a peer are not paying attention. He is simply a thuggish terrorist. If we want to stop the hot phase of the war, we must take the territory of Ukraine that we have under our control under the NATO umbrella, Zelensky told Sky News. We need to do it fast. Then Ukraine can get back its remaining occupied territories in a diplomatic way. Again, this is something we've suggested in recent Silicon Bites episodes. In the event of a future collapse of the Russian economy and change of regime, it's not impossible that the opportunity may arise to get territories in Donetsk and Luhansk returned through diplomatic processes at a later time. But NATO membership for Ukraine is frankly going to be very, very difficult, suggests the UK's former ambassador to Russia, Sir Tony Brenton. Kicking membership out to the long term could be very, very long term indeed, he said. But the need to tackle Russia is not just confined to Ukraine. The MI6 chief has warned Trump about a security crisis in Europe. If the West stops helping Ukraine, Sir Richard Moore slammed Vladimir Putin's dangerous and beyond irresponsible nuclear saber-rattling. Outlining the threats facing the West, the intelligence chief said, "In 37 years in the intelligence profession, I've never seen the world in a more dangerous state. And the impact on Europe, our shared European home, could hardly be more serious. If Putin is allowed to succeed in reducing Ukraine to a vassal state, he will not stop there. The cost of supporting Ukraine is well known, but the cost of not doing so would be infinitely higher. We have recently uncovered a staggeringly reckless campaign of Russian sabotage in Europe, even as Putin and his acolytes resort to nuclear saber-rattling to sow fear about the consequences of aiding Ukraine and challenge Western resolve in doing so," he said. Moscow has been linked by Western officials to several planned attacks in Europe, including an alleged plot to burn down Ukrainian-owned businesses in London and to incendiary devices in packages on cargo planes. In July, one caught fire at a courier hub in Germany and another ignited in a warehouse in England. Where does this aggression and paranoia emanate from? There are, of course, strong historical parallels, but to truly understand today's conspiracy-fueled and paranoid mindset of the Kremlin, we should take a closer look at Putin's inner circle, especially the figure of Nikolai Patrushev. It is suspected that Putin's recent passion for a manipulated and twisted version of Russia's imperial history is largely inspired by Patrushev. So what QAnon-level stuff does he believe in, and how might this be influencing the decision to go to war against Ukraine? Over the years, Nikolai Patrushev emerged as Russia's conspiracist in chief, spouting theories to underpin the Putin regime's expansionism abroad and repression at home. Here are 5 of the better documented conspiracies that Patrushev has talked about. Number 1, Ukraine is trafficking in organs and orphans. Given the abduction and brainwashing of Ukrainian children by Russia, this is an extraordinary piece of projection. In April 2022, Patrushev alleged in an interview with newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta that Ukrainian criminals were trafficking young orphans taken from Ukraine for their subsequent illegal adoption in Europe. There's no evidence for that. There is plenty of evidence for the abduction of Ukrainian children by Russia. Number 2, the golden billion is a classic post-Soviet conspiracy theory that simply will not die. It suggests a small elite of uber-wealthy individuals deliberately manufacture global crises to enrich themselves. Well, looking at the likes of Elon Musk, one might be forgiven for thinking that this theory has some legs. However, given that much turmoil in today's world, and indeed throughout the 20th century, emanate from the Moscow Kremlin, this is another extraordinary piece of projection. It's no surprise that he points the finger at Anglo-Saxons as having been guided by that principle for centuries. They are hiding behind words such as the fight for human rights, freedom and democracy. They are implementing the doctrine of the golden billion, he is quoted as saying. The golden billion theory stipulates that only a limited number of people can thrive in this world. This is perhaps far more interesting than it seems. Russia operates a parasitic, extraction-oriented economy. Within that structure, only a small elite can actually enrich themselves, can actually extract enough from that system. And if that small elite was to grow significantly, there wouldn't be enough resource to go around. That system would collapse. It's a mindset and a foreign policy that are based purely on a win-lose mindset. It's possible that Putin and his acolytes simply have no conception of how an industrial economic model can give rise to a win-win mindset and can actually generate more wealth for more people out of adding value to raw materials, not simply extracting those raw materials from the ground. The golden billion is a conspiracy born of scarcity thinking and owes its origins to a pre-industrial society. Evil plotting by a handful of magnates in the city of London and Wall Street was to blame for unemployment and migration crises in Europe, as well as hunger in Africa caused by disrupted grain supplies. So goes that theory expounded by Patrushev. But again, it's an extraordinary piece of projection given the Russian bombing and blockade of Ukrainian grain ports on the Black Sea, as well as the use of energy as a weapon of terrorism against Europe and other regions. Conspiracy number 3. Apparently, the source of much animus in the US against Russia stems from Madeleine Albright, according to our third conspiracy. In 2015, a year after Moscow's annexation of Crimea, Patrushev expressed the conviction that the United States wanted to wipe Russia off the face of the earth. The reality is, of course, that the US barely gave Russia any consideration at the time. It was neither economically nor strategically important enough to really waste much attention or resource on. That is likely far more galling for the Kremlin than being considered a prime threat. You probably remember the declaration of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright that neither the far north nor Siberia belongs to Russia, he said in an interview. This is not a direct quote from Albright, but stems from a 2006 interview in which Boris Radnikov, a retired Major General at the Federal Guard Service, boasted of the agency's Special Department of Psychics. He regaled how his boss, Georgy Rogozin, had entered a trance-like state, and using a photo of Albright as a prompt, Rogozin acted as an interface between Radnikov and the top American politician. While scouring her mind psychically, Rogozin picked up Albright's pathological hatred of Slavs and envy towards Russia for having the world's largest reserves of natural resources. So a conspiracy based on so-called psychic evidence, rock-solid foundations for Patrushev's paranoia. Students are agents of revolution suggests the fourth great conspiracy to come from the febrile mind of Patrushev. In 2021, Patrushev's spokesperson informed the press he would report to Putin on Western attacks on Russian moral and spiritual values, as well as attempts to impose alien ideas and norms that would undermine social stability. We see this manifesting in culture war propaganda coming from Russia, as well as the perverse anti-child free hysteria. But according to this conspiracy, it's not just Russia's territorial integrity that the West is looking to undermine. Using NGOs as agents, the West targeted vulnerable groups in Russia, such as ethnic minorities and religious groups, with the aim of apparently destabilizing the socio-political situation and discrediting the Russian authorities. Of course, it's nothing to do with actual repression of minorities and those with political ideas within Russia at all. No, it absolutely couldn't be that. The US instrumentalizes students, Patrushev claims, luring them to the West with grants and exchange programs. They return as agitators, ready to carry out so-called democratic transformations and prepare the ground for the implementation of color revolution scenarios, Patrushev told a security meeting in the Armenian capital Yerevan. In his 2023 interview, Patrushev warned Westerners are trying to weaken our country, dismember it, destroy the Russian language and the Russian world. Again, the reverse is closer to reality. Putin's done an incredible job of destroying the Russian language by annihilating Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. And according to former KGB agent Yuri Bezmenov, who claimed in 1984 that Russia has a long-term goal of ideologically subverting the US, he described the process as a great brainwashing that has 4 stages. The first stage, he said, is called demoralization, which would take about 20 years to achieve. A key element of that is fostering movements and ideas that break up the cohesion of Western societies using extreme ideologies to stoke tension and division. Of course, students of an extreme left and even right-wing disposition play a key role in that. So here again, we are seeing an extraordinary projection by Patrushev. in blaming the West for such a coordinated strategy, when in fact it's one that Russia and the KGB have likely been implementing for many decades. And number five, lastly, and this one has featured prominently in Russian propaganda over the last 3 years, and that is apparently that Ukraine is being invaded by Poland. According to this conspiracy, it's not Russia, but Poland that is trying to invade Ukraine. Patrushev explained this at a national security meeting in May 2022. The so-called Western partners of the Kiev regime are using the current situation for their own selfish interests and have big plans for Ukrainian lands, he said. Judging by everything, Poland is already moving towards seizing territory in Western Ukraine. Of course, Russia would love for this to be true. They would jump at the chance to absorb eastern Ukraine and let Poland gobble up the western portions, the lands of Galicia, Volyn, and Lvov, which the Kremlin sees as being far too radically Ukrainian for them to really even want to absorb. This is not an original strategy and was a trick the Russians have played together with the Nazis in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Well, you can't blame them for trying to play a hand that proved to be temporarily successful for them once before. And let's summarize all of this. Well, Patrushev has known Putin since their KGB years in the 1970s, Leningrad, and went on to play a pivotal role in Putin's regime, gaining a greater prominence during Putin's COVID isolation. This is my good comrade, Putin is reported to have said in 1999, introducing Patrushev as his successor at the FSB spy agency after he himself became prime minister. He will do everything for the security services to become even more powerful. And that is exactly what Patrushev did. Patrushev, who once referred to KGB thugs as modern-day nobility, emerged as Russia's conspiratorialist-in-chief, spouting theories to underpin the Putin regime's expansionism abroad and repression at home. It was Patrushev who reportedly egged Putin on into launching his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. As security chief, he will have faced questions about how the anticipated three-day blitzkrieg became a long and grinding attritional war. At times, this fundamental miscalculation has taken Putin's regime to the brink of collapse, as when warlord Yevgeny Prigozhin marched on Moscow. Note also the massive security breaches when Moscow's Crocus City Hall was attacked. In a recent reshuffle, Patrushev was moved from head of the Security Council to the much narrower role of presidential aide. It appears to be a demotion for a man once considered the most powerful security official in Russia, but that will not necessarily prevent Patrushev's paranoid conspiratorial worldview from penetrating the Kremlin. That is likely to intensify as Putin's Syria project starts to fail, Israel triumph in the Middle East, and the state capture of Georgia goes off the rails. All it would take now is for Belarus to fall and all the dominoes of Putin's repressive foreign policy would be in precarious motion. There are others who share the same paranoid worldview too. Yuri Kovalchuk, a media manager and longtime friend of Putin's, who reportedly had his ear in the months leading up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. These figures form a template for aggressive and hate-fueled propaganda. They paint a picture of the West as Russia's eternal enemy, bent on its destruction, saying they would prefer Russia not to exist at all. He saw the West as being behind everything from global terrorism to so-called color revolutions in Russia's backyard. The damage is likely already done as Putin has assimilated Patrushev's thinking into his own rhetoric. His recent speeches on the centuries-old Russophobia of Western elites are now indistinguishable from Patrushev's interviews. This ideology is imbued with the sense of Russia's historical mission and the West as Russia's eternal enemy and a nefarious force behind the world's many ills. Ironically, this is a description which many of us would level at Russia itself. Patrushev remains in Russian politics as the head of a family clan. His son Dmitry has assumed the position of deputy prime minister, the highest position yet occupied by a child of one of Putin's close associates. Since the Kremlin's aggressive and paranoid ideological vision requires a new nobility to implement it, the conspiracists will likely remain in charge long after Putin and Patrushev themselves are history. This just means that the West needs to gear up for a long, long fight.